Okay, hello and welcome to our weekly webinar series. I'm Lauren from the Jane Goodall Institute of Canada, and I am the Roots and Shoots Manager of the Roots and Shoots program at the Jane Goodall Institute of Canada. And I'm super excited to be here. This is our second to last webinar of our fall webinar series. So we're almost at the end. We'll be taking a break next week, but we'll be back the week after for our final webinar on the wild world of chimpanzees, which would be super fun. But today we're going to be talking about sustainable food and zoonotic diseases, which is obviously something that's very topical today as COVID-19 is a zoonotic disease, and we're now in this pandemic and kind of dealing with the aftermath of a zoonotic disease that is novel and that we haven't encountered before. So today we're going to be talking about how our food choices influence and how our impacts as humans influence the emergence of zoonotic diseases and what we can do as individuals to make better and more sustainable food choices to reduce our risks of these pandemics hopefully happening again. So I'm going to start the presentation. So again, if anyone has any questions, just please pop them in the chat box. I'm happy to answer them at the end, and we will get started. So when we talk about zoonotic diseases, just wanted to kind of give an intro about what they are. So animals can carry harmful germs that cause diseases in humans. And zoonotic diseases are caused either by germs like viruses, bacteria, parasites, and fungi. And animals can sometimes appear totally healthy. They might not actually be sick at all, but they can pass on those germs to humans and cause us to get sick. And actually 3 out of every 4 new or emerging infectious diseases in people are coming from animals. And so there are very different kinds of zoonotic diseases. There's diseases we can get from wild animals, diseases we can get from livestock, and diseases that can come from both. So in terms of wildlife, some of the most well-known diseases are Lyme disease, and those can come from ticks, and Ebola, which comes from our ape relatives, so gorillas and chimpanzees can pass on Ebola. And then in livestock, some of the more well-known ones are bovine spongiform encephalopathy, which is more well known as mad cow disease. And also in the middle, which wildlife or livestock or domesticated animals can give us are things like rabies. So we can get that from dogs, or we can get that from, say, raccoons, or things like the plague. The plague came from rats, but it could also be transmitted in other animals. So kind of a lot of different viruses and bacteria and germs out there that we can get from animals, but these are just some of the more common ones you might have heard of. So how do zoonotic diseases spread? So there's 4 ways that they can spread. One is vector-borne. So this means you're getting bitten by like a tick or a mosquito or a flea, and then they transfer through their saliva some sort of germ. So with ticks, they can transfer Lyme disease or a variety of other diseases, and that's why ticks are quite dangerous. And it's super important if you're going for a hike, especially where we live in Southern Ontario, ticks are becoming very widespread. And so make sure if you do go out with your dogs or with your pets or with your family on hikes to definitely do a tick check at the end. And ticks that carry Lyme disease are like this tiny, like they're the speck of like a grain of sand or a grain of rice, super, super tiny. So make sure you're checking to make sure that you don't, so you can get rid of them before they bite. And then mosquitoes can carry malaria. That's not an issue we have here in Canada, but if you've ever been to southern countries like in Africa or in South America, different places have different likelihoods of malaria. I know when I went to Africa, I had to take anti-malarial medication to make sure that I didn't get malaria. So then you can also get air or waterborne diseases. So this is just being in close proximity to or drinking water from contaminated water. So this can be things like the flu. We can get avian flu, we can get swine flu from being in close proximity to those livestock animals, or things like E. coli that can pass through contaminated water that can get into the groundwater or into kind of farming water. As well as direct proximity or direct contact. So this is actually getting bitten or scratched by an animal or coming into contact with bodily fluids. So that's how things like rabies can spread if you get bit by a rabid animal, or something like Ebola, which can spread through direct bodily fluids. And then you have foodborne. So this is food that has been contaminated with animal feces or improperly cooked food. So something like salmonella would be in that category. So that can come from improperly cooked eggs. And you can just, if you don't cook it properly, if it's there, you can get sick. So in the last kind of 100 years, we have had quite a few kind of zoonotic diseases that have popped up and caused quite, quite a few issues for us as humans. The one on kind of that we've looked to compare to the COVID pandemic now is the Spanish flu back in 1918. So just like that we've had this kind of second wave now that we're in right now, the Spanish flu did the same thing. It was and came, first wave went down, and then the second wave came and was actually worse, which seems to be what we're seeing right now with our second wave we're currently in. The most recent influenza spillover event, so that's when a flu like virus or a flu virus goes from the animals to us, spills over into humans. This was the swine flu, H1N1 in 2009, and this killed over 15,000 people. So, these viruses are no joke. They definitely are taking lots of lives. They make people sick. And we really need to kind of look at the ways that we're treating animals and look at this kind of interconnection between people, animals, and the environment, and how we can do more to prevent these diseases coming into the human population, and how we're treating animals in the environment is a huge part of that. So what factors are increasing zoonosis emergence? So these are kind of 5 ways that we as humans are impacting the natural world to increase our risk of getting zoonotic diseases. So the first is deforestation and other land changes. So when we take away an animal's environment, they usually have no choice than to come into kind of our environments because they don't have any other homes to go to. So when we cut down forests for farming, if we cut down forests for housing developments, then those animals still need somewhere to live, and we're kind of getting closer to the animals and to their environment, so they can't, they kind of get more close contact with us. So we're more likely to get into close contact. Even in Toronto, in such a big city that's been here for so long, we still have lots of wildlife. We have coyotes, we have foxes, we have raccoons. We have lots of animals that are involved in our lives here, and that can cause diseases and pass on, especially to our things like our dogs and our cats. Then we have intensified agriculture and livestock production. So when we, when we shifted to these more large-scale factory farms, we're putting animals in very close contact with each other that can easily spread diseases amongst each other. This leads to an overuse of antibiotics, and then that leads to the third thing, which is antimicrobial resistance. So as we use many, many different antibiotics, bacteria evolve and survive, and then they become resistant to those antibiotics, and it can be really difficult to fight those antibiotic-resistant bacteria. It can cause people to get quite sick if we can't support them with antibiotics. So the agriculture and antimicrobial resistance kind of go hand in hand, as well as the general overuse of antibiotics in general. And then we have illegally and poorly regulated wildlife trade. So this is what we see when we see, say, some of the wet markets that we see in China, in Africa, and South America, where animals are hunted from the forest, are brought into these markets where they come into contact with wildlife, and livestock, and all these other animals, and they're being unfortunately killed and butchered. Bodily fluids are mixing, and you end up getting these novel viruses that can then be passed on to humans. So that's how they think COVID-19 spread, was through a wet market in China. And right now, I think the latest research is it likely came from a bat and possibly mixed in a pangolin, which is a very, very endangered species that is very highly coveted for its spiny coating, which is actually just made made up of what our nails are made up with, which is keratin, but because there's beliefs that this can be a holistic medicine in Chinese traditions, and unfortunately they are very highly poached and killed. So I think that's likely the latest research was for sure a bat, maybe a pangolin. And then the last thing is climate change. So as our climate's changing, as we have these milder winters in Toronto. I know for us right now, it was like summer a couple weeks ago, and then we got crazy snow. So the weather's just all over the place. But with the less cold winters we're having overall, especially in Southern Ontario, we're getting more ticks coming up from the United States. And ticks, like I mentioned, can cause quite a number of diseases, specifically Lyme disease, Rocky Mountain fever, some really terrible diseases that we don't want to have. So we really need to be aware that climate change is also a factor in the emergence of these diseases as well. So one of the kind of biggest zoonotic diseases that has kind of made history in our generation, our lifetime, is HIV. So HIV didn't become the kind of pandemic proportions until about the 1980s. But before then, it was spreading at very low levels in humans in Africa. And there are three hypotheses as to how it emerged and how it came about. But hypothesis A is what right now has the most evidence. So what probably happened is there were two different monkey species that each had a strain of SIV, which is simian immunodeficiency virus. So this is like HIV in humans, but it affects simians, which are primates, instead. So those two monkeys were then eaten by one chimpanzee. So chimpanzees do hunt monkeys, so they do tend to hunt them on occasion. And so this one chimpanzee would have eaten parts of these two monkeys. Those two SIV virus strains recombined in that chimpanzee to create a new novel virus that could then be passed on to humans, and that passed on to a human who butchered that chimpanzee, probably got some bodily fluids of that chimp, maybe blood, into a cut or a sore, and then HIV then transferred into humans. So it obviously was quite a combination of events that allowed this to happen. But once it did, this was in the 1920s in the Democratic Republic of Congo. So for many, many years, it kind of stayed low level. It didn't really explode. And then it was really more in the 1980s when it came over to North America, and it kind of exploded and became this really horrible pandemic. And it was really tough to figure out what it was at first, because it was people were having very different symptoms. There can be a long time gap between when you're infected with HIV and when you can get the AIDS, when you get AIDS itself. So it took a while to figure it out, but now we're really lucky. There are amazing drugs to help people with AIDS and HIV to manage their symptoms and manage the disease. So it is something that is, while not curable because it can't be cured, it can definitely be treatable now, and death rates have gone down quite a bit. It isn't a virus that we were able to get a vaccine for, unfortunately. So that's why we went the medication route. So when we're talking about food systems and zoonotic diseases, really our food choices and how we obtain our food has a direct impact on the spread of certain zoonotic diseases. So we as humans and we as individuals can really make a difference when it comes to the spread of these diseases. So poaching and catching wild animals and keeping them in small cages in these markets is obviously not good for the animals or for us, because it increases the rates of these diseases getting out into human populations of these diseases, these viruses recombining so they can get into humans. Normally in the wild, all of these animals wouldn't be crammed together. You wouldn't have, livestock, next to wild animals. So these novel diseases can kind of combine and come out in situations that aren't kind of natural. And these usually, these animals are usually, unfortunately, killed on the spot, which, there's bodily fluids, there's blood. all of these things can kind of mix and enter into wounds or open sores on humans, spreading these diseases. So this is how COVID-19 spread. This is how SARS spread. So obviously this is kind of a hot spot for these types of diseases spreading. And especially when it's a novel virus like COVID-19 or like SARS, we as humans don't have any real defense against it because our body hasn't encountered it before. So it has no immune response versus, say, a flu or a cold where our bodies have encountered those before, maybe not every strain. And that's why novel flu strains like swine flu or avian flu can also be very dangerous. So in terms of kind of our livestock food systems, by keeping livestock tightly packed, like the pigs you see here in a factory farm, we are very much increasing the likelihood of disease spreading. Just like we know that COVID-19 spreads when we're in close contact with people breathing the same air, not very well ventilated, the same thing can happen with pigs or with cows or with chickens, spreading flu-like diseases. And usually when we're talking about livestock, it's either some sort of flu or some sort of bacteria. And then also the overuse of bacteria, like I mentioned, can lead to antibiotic resistance, not only in the animals, but also in us as humans. There are some antibiotic-resistant bacteria like C. difficile that can be very dangerous and very life-threatening because we just don't have ways to treat them anymore because they're resistant to all known antibiotics. And factory farming also has what we call tailing ponds. So these are bodies of water, like little ponds outside of the farm. That is where all the feces and waste products are kept. This can sometimes leak into the groundwater. It can sometimes leak out into neighboring fields. And this is how we can sometimes get those outbreaks of E. coli, like in romaine lettuce is really common to have outbreaks of E. coli and things like that. So that's why we might see those outbreaks in food that isn't an animal product. And then also animals are bred for very specific traits. So it's very popular for chicken breasts are very popular now. So chickens are bred to have very large breasts, so farmers can get kind of the most bang for their buck with their chickens. But breeding animals, so they're all very similar, leads to very low genetic variety. So when you have low genetic variety, a virus or a bacteria or some sort of other germ can get into that population and spread like wildfire. That's why as humans, it's so important, and for any animal species, it's so important to have genetic diversity because it's that genetic diversity that gives you the ability to fight off a variety of different diseases and bacteria because you have, a very varied immune system from your two parents. But when we're breeding animals for specific traits, they're all very similar, so they have very low genetic diversity. Also, slaughterhouses pose health risks for human workers. They are, in contact with lots of animal bodily fluids. They're in close contact with each other. We saw many slaughterhouse outbreaks of COVID-19 at the beginning of the pandemic, just because the conditions are so ripe for disease spread. That wasn't obviously being spread from the cattle that was being slaughtered, but just from the close contact of the individual workers. So it's not only not a great situation for the animals, but it's also not great for the people working in these slaughterhouses as well. So what can you do? So I don't want this to be all doom and gloom because I know it can be really hard, especially right now. I think we're all getting pretty fatigued with this pandemic and pretty frustrated that it's continuing to go on. But I think we need to stay the course so we can get through this and hopefully get to those vaccines that are hopefully coming out. But what can you do in the meantime to help prevent future spread of these zoonotic diseases? So the biggest thing that you can do is move towards a plant-based diet. So I'm not saying everyone needs to become vegan. I myself am about 80% vegan, but it's not something you need to switch to right away. If you can even reduce the amount of meat you eat once a week, to do like meatless Mondays, or have one meal a day where you don't eat meat. So say your lunch or your breakfast, you don't eat meat, and then maybe you have something meat-based at dinner. Any steps that you can take to reduce your meat intake reduces the need to produce as much meat as we are now. And if you do choose to eat meat, try to make more informed choices about where your meat is coming from. So go to your local butcher, ask where their meat is coming from. Is it coming from factory farms, or is it coming from local small-scale farmers who treat their animals well, who don't cram them into these, small enclosures? Organic meat is also a better option than than factory farm meat or conventional meat because they don't use antibiotics. So we're getting away from that issue. So there's many alternatives you can choose to factory farm meat. As I know, meat is a big part of a lot of people's cultures and diets, but taking those steps, even if it's just baby steps, personally, I stopped eating beef and pork, and then I ate chicken for many, many years, still chicken and fish. And then I stopped eating chicken, and then eventually stopped eating fish, and now have phased out most dairy as well. And you can definitely take your time. You don't have to do it cold turkey, but it is definitely something that can be super helpful when we're talking about the spread of these diseases. And also educate other people to what we call the One Health approach, or what kind of we say at JGI Canada is this interconnectedness. So we are part of the environment. We are animals. As humans, we're part of the animal kingdom as well. We are mammals, we are primates, and everything is interconnected. So our health is very tied into animal health and environmental health. So when animals are healthy, when they are thriving, we and the environment are thriving too. And it all kind of works together in this interconnected way. And what I really love about what Jane has to say is that she believes that if we show more respect for nature, if we show that respect that is so much deserved of the animals and plants we share this planet with, we can all have a brighter future. And I think that's so important for us to remember, and why Jane is just such this amazing figure of hope in these dark times, especially. So that's kind of all I have to say in terms of the presentation. So I really hope that through this, you guys were able to learn a few new things about where foods come from, why diseases spread as they do, and why, this has become obviously something we're all living with in this day, in 2020 through this pandemic. And I think we really need to look at our own food choices, at what we're doing to impact animals in the environment, because if we don't take greater steps, we're going to continue on the same path we're on. These diseases will come back again. We might be in another pandemic, and unless we change our ways, then we will likely be back here, hopefully not anytime soon, but it will happen again. And I very, very distinctly remember when I was in college, learning about pandemics, learning about the Black Plague, other pandemics, our professor saying, it's not when, but but when a pandemic will happen next. And we were very overdue for one at that time. And I never really even thought that I would experience a pandemic in my lifetime, but obviously we all are right now. And I think it's up to us to start changing our ways, making better choices, and educating each other about the importance of those choices so we can all live a better and healthier life for the planet, for us, for animals. So thank you so much for everyone who tuned in. If anyone has any questions, I'm happy to answer those today. Also, if anyone's interested in doing a project on sustainable food, we do have funding to support that project for youth through what we call our APE fund. So this is up to $1,000 for youth to do sustainable food projects in their local communities in Canada. And all of the information is on our website. It is open until December 11th if you want to apply, and funding will go out in January and February. So we really want to support the work to move towards a more sustainable food future. And so that's why we do support projects such as those with our grant work. So please apply if you're interested. You can also contact me at lauren@janegoodall.ca if you have any questions about the grant, about how it works, and if you want more information about any of the topics we talked about here today. And again, you can learn all about Roots and Shoots at rootsandshoots.ca. We also have a sustainable food guide on our website too that has lots of information about different ways you can eat sustainably, about different ways that we can move towards a more sustainable food future. So please check that out as well. So Charlene, thank you for your comment, and thank you for your kind words. And yeah, you would think that given, the huge economic costs that we have all suffered through this pandemic, that leaders would be doing more towards moving towards a more sustainable food practices, and hopefully hopefully with this, they will. I think there is a lot of pressure from food lobbies, from agriculture lobbies to not stop that, unfortunately. But I think if we all work together, we can make a difference. And even if we all vote with our dollars, we go to the grocery store, we move towards eating in a more sustainable way, hopefully people will hear us. And I think that's already starting to happen. There are so many more vegan meat alternatives out there than there were even a few years ago, from Beyond Meat, Impossible Meat, all of the alternative dairy products now. I feel very lucky to be, 90%, 80% vegan at the moment, because there's just so many options at the grocery store that I don't really miss out on all of the food that I used to eat. So it's really nice. And so Samantha says, important project, check out website. Great, thank you, Samantha. And so we have one question from our listeners in the studio. Any speak to any solutions coming from the scientific community to address antibiotic resistance? So I'm not that knowledgeable about that topic. Unfortunately, I did study bio, but not on that side of things. But I think that hopefully there is work being done there. I think we can only try to keep one step ahead of the bacteria, as much as it seems crazy that we have to do that. They're these tiny little organisms, but I think that it's just more research, developing new drugs to kind of combat that. But we also have to look at the overuse of antibiotics and try to reduce that on that side as well. Okay, well, thank you so much, everyone. Such great comments. I'm really happy you enjoyed the talk today. So I'm going to end the broadcast here. And again, please check out any information on our website. Give me a shout. I'm happy to chat anytime. And have a good evening, everyone, or afternoon. Bye.